Well, hello again, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the OLA Adult Ed Faith Formation Gospel Podcasts, where we get together every week and spend about 15 minutes, sometimes 20, unpacking the Sunday Gospel. So as we say, when we hear it proclaimed in Mass, we'll have a better understanding of and appreciation for what the Word of God has for us. And again, we're in the year of Luke. So this Sunday's Gospel will be coming from the Gospel of Luke. It'll be the third of 3 straight weeks we've been looking at specifically Luke's recording of the Sermon on the Mount, or as it's called in his Gospel, the Sermon on the Plain. Recall that we said 2 weeks ago that the church puts in front of us for the next 3 weeks Luke's recording of the Sermon on the Mount, which is shorter than Matthew's. This is the third and final installment of that, and then next Sunday we'll be moving on further into the Gospel of Luke. This comes to us from Luke 6, verses 39 to 45, which is 6 verses, but again, under the heading of You Can't Exhaust God, Jesus gives 4 different sayings in these 6 verses. So over the course of this podcast, what I'm going to be doing is kind of separating out each of the 4 sayings and kind of unpacking 1 or 2 key elements of each saying. Okay? Now, what are these sayings? If we were to tag names on it, the first saying we'll call the 2 blind men. The second saying we're going to call the disciple and the teacher. The third saying we're going to call the log and the speck. And then the fourth and final saying we're going to call the good tree and the bad tree. So Luke 6, 39 to 45, 4 sayings in order: the 2 blind men, the disciple and the teacher, the log and the speck, and the good tree and the bad tree. So that'll be what these 6 verses consist of. As always, Max, the brains of the operation, is behind the camera making this all happen. I'm just a talking head, as we say. We're on the campus of St. Bonaventure High School. So let's go ahead and get started. Luke 6, 39 to 45, the third of 3 straight weeks of Luke's recording of the Sermon on the Mount. Interesting way this passage starts. I indicated that what Jesus is going to give are 4 different, and I used the term sayings, okay? But look how Luke starts us off. He says, Jesus told his disciples a parable. And then he goes on and gives them 4 different sayings. So even before almost I hit the play button, we got to hit the pause button, and we got to say, wait a second. Jesus is telling his disciples one parable. And then he goes on and gives them 4 multiple sayings. So how do we reconcile that? Well, when we think of Jesus giving a parable, and rightly so because most of his parables are in this form, we think of kind of a short story, something that is a story with a spiritual meaning behind it, right? But not all of his parables came in the form of these short stories. Most of them did. That's why when we think of a parable, we think of a short story. The vast majority of his parables came in that form, short stories, right? But there are some parables that he taught that came in the form of short, quick sayings. And this is one instance of it. So when Luke says Jesus told his disciples a parable, he was not confused. This was a parable, and it was the type of parable that Jesus would say that would include not just 1 short story, but 4 short sayings. So that's the first line. Jesus told his disciples a parable. This, in fact, is a parable. Now, the parable consists in 4 sayings, right? The first one we titled, The 2 Blind Men. So here's how Luke records it. These are Jesus' words. Can a blind person guide a blind person? Will not both fall into a pit? That's the first saying. Can a blind person guide a blind person? Will not both fall into a pit? Now, he's asking this in the form of a question, but it's kind of a rhetorical question, because obviously the answer is no, okay? On the natural level, okay, if you've got one blind person trying to lead another blind person someplace, they're not going to get there. So on a natural level, this can't happen, right? But we know parables are infused with a spiritual meaning. So what is the spiritual meaning behind this natural example? Well, when he's talking about a blind person, spiritually speaking, it's not that he's physically blind. He's talking about spiritual blindness. So we are to read this or listen to it and understand it if we insert the word spiritual in there. So can a spiritually blind person guide a spiritually blind person? Will they both not fall into a pit? So he's talking about not physical eyesight, but spiritual eyesight, spiritual blindness, which brings up the next question: what connotates, what does spiritual blindness consist of? What does that mean? Well, in this vein, it means a spiritual blind person in this vein means one that is not aware of and or recognizes and acknowledges his own faults, his own spiritual faults, his own spiritual sinfulness. So what Jesus is getting to here is, can a person who doesn't recognize, acknowledge his own spiritual shortcomings and faults and sins, can that kind of person lead another person, rightly and properly lead another person spiritually? And of course, the answer is no. So that's the spiritual meaning behind this first saying of this overall parable. Okay? Now he immediately moves into the second saying, which we titled The Disciple and the Teacher. Here's where he goes. He says, "No disciple is superior to his teacher, but when fully trained, every disciple will be like his teacher." Now again, what is he getting to here? Well, the teacher is God himself. The disciple is all of us, because the word disciple means learner. You know, people, just kind of a side note, you hear the word disciple and you hear the word apostle, and people say, they're basically the same thing, or they're two different ways of saying the same thing, when that's not the case at all. A disciple is completely different from an apostle by virtue of the fact of what those two words mean. A disciple means learner, and apostle means one who is sent. So he's talking about a disciple here. He's talking about a person, you and I, learning from Jesus, from God. Okay? And he's making an obvious point, right? No disciple is superior to his teacher. We are not superior to God. We're not God, he is, right? But then he says, but when fully trained, every disciple will be like his teacher. So the disciple, all of us, are not the teacher. We're not God. But the key is that we are like him. We imitate Christ in the way we think and the way we speak and in the way we live our lives. So the goal of being a disciple, okay, one of the goals is to be able to imitate the teacher, not be the teacher, because we're not God, we're not Jesus, but to be like Jesus, to imitate him in thoughts, words, and deeds. So that's the spiritual message behind the second saying of this parable. Then he moves right into that third saying, which we titled The Log and the Speck. And I would submit, of all four of these sayings that comprise this parable, this might be kind of the most well-known. And here's how Luke records it. All right. "Why do you notice the splinter in your brother's eye, but do not perceive the wooden beam in your own? How can you say to your brother, 'Brother, let me remove the splinter in your eye,' when you do not even notice the wooden beam in your own eye? You hypocrite! Remove the wooden beam from your eye first, then you will see clearly to remove the splinter in your brother's eye." Probably, again, arguably the most well-known of these four sayings, the log and the speck. Now, on a natural level, okay, you're thinking, wait a second, okay, you've got two individuals, right? One individual has a splinter in his eye. Okay, I can see that happens. The other individual has a wooden beam, a whole log, like a fireplace log, right, in their eye. And come on, come on, this is ridiculous. Well, this is one of the cases, and Jesus does use this this technique in parables. Is sometimes he'll exaggerate a point, almost to the point of hyperbole, to make a point, right? And the point that he makes in parables, again, is a spiritual point. So what's the spiritual point with one guy with a log in his eye trying to take out the splinter in another guy's eye? Okay? Again, it goes to, the guy with the log in his eye, again, is the guy that doesn't recognize or acknowledge his spiritual faults, his spiritual weaknesses, his shortcomings, his sins, okay? He doesn't acknowledge those. But then he'll be very quick to acknowledge the weaknesses, the faults, the sins of others. And in using the wooden beam versus the splinter, okay, what Jesus is trying to do is trying to make the greatest possible distinction between the two. Because if I put a wooden beam on this tabletop and I put a splinter next to it, I mean, obviously, the difference in size between them would be readily apparent. So Jesus is using a wooden beam and a splinter to really make the point of, before you judge and condemn and get on people for maybe their small faults and weaknesses and sins, maybe you better, take a closer look at your own weaknesses and faults and sins, which may even be larger. And how can you, in that spiritual state, how can you possibly give somebody a hard time in the other spiritual state, okay? Because he says if you do, he says you're a hypocrite. And what you should do is kind of put your own house in order, basically, right? Remove the wooden beam in your eye before you even think about removing a splinter in your brother's eye. It's kind of a similar way of saying it would be don't throw stones if you live in a glass house. Kind of same deal, okay? Kind of self-reflect, self-awareness. Make sure your own house is in order first before you try and straighten out somebody else's house, okay? So that's kind of what he's getting to there. And then he wraps up this parable, which includes 4 sayings, with what we titled the good tree and the bad tree. A good tree does not bear rotten fruit, nor does a rotten tree bear good fruit. Every tree is known by its own fruit. People do not pick figs from thorn bushes, nor do they gather grapes from brambles. A good person out of the store of his goodness in his heart produces good. But an evil person out of a store of evil produces evil. For from the fullness of the heart, the mouth speaks. So a couple of things we want to mention here. He starts out by saying, look, okay, on the natural level, a good tree is not going to bear rotten fruit. A good tree will bear good fruit. A rotten tree will bear rotten fruit. And he's saying it's the same on the spiritual realm, right? Okay. The fruit comes from the tree, right? So a person's good or evil comes from the heart. And what you say and what you do are your fruits, right? They're what you see. And they come from your heart. So if you have a good heart, then you will bear good fruit. Your words will be good. Your deeds will be good. If you have an evil heart, it's going to produce evil words and evil deeds. Just like the fruit comes from the tree, your words and your deeds come ultimately from your heart. Your heart is your storehouse of either your goodness or your evilness. What you say and what you do, that's really what the manifestation of what's in your heart. The source is your heart. So just like a good tree will bear good fruit, a good heart will bear good words and good deeds. A bad tree bears bad fruit, an evil heart will produce evil words and evil deeds. So again, a parable that consists of 4 short, quick sayings, and because they're all wrapped up into a parable, as Luke indicates at the beginning, even though they're 4 separate sayings, there are some commonalities among them. There are some common denominators among them. So if we kind of wrap up this podcast, and Max is showing me the monitor, and we're at the 15.5-minute mark, so give me about a minute or so more, is some of the commonalities we can take away from this is, if you say, okay, well, basically what is he getting to in these 4 short sayings? He's hitting a lot on, look, take stock of yourself. Do self-reflection. Do examinations of conscience, okay? Take a look at your own house and see what kind of state it's in. Take a look at your own heart, your own soul. See what kind of state it's in, right? And make sure that your house is in order. Make sure that your heart is in the right place, that it's good, before you then go out and say something or do something, or certainly before you try and admonish or correct other people, So basically it's, if I take anything away from this parable, it's just that the continuous need to do an examination of conscience to make sure that my own house is in order. Because, we're all sinners. It's easy for our houses to get in disarray. But it's a constant reminder, at least this passage is to just, check in. Check in with your heart. Check in with yourself spiritually, continually, and make sure you're not living in a glass house, right, and throwing stones. Make sure your own house is in order. So that's basically what this parable of 4 quick sayings is saying. So with that said, I will quickly wrap up. We will move out of the Sermon on the Mount next Sunday, and we'll continue on in the Gospel of Luke in the year of Luke. Until we do that, as always, take care and God bless.